Hello everyone. I made this little project with these two buttons to help illustrate how flow of data works with Redux versus just normal React in the Flux architecture. So both these buttons, when pressed, increment the count that is above them, and they also change color, and there's a few that they can go through. And then when you hit reset, they go back to the original color that they were at, and the count also resets to 0. Each button has its own reset function, so I decided to keep those separate for that, just so you could reset them on the fly. So how this looks is we have our main app.js, which we have our regular stuff imported, and then we have stuff set up for our reducer. So I go ahead and I make my data store here, because app is our parent most component. So we want to wrap that with the provider tag, and we import provider from React-Redux, which is a library that allows Redux to essentially work with React, hence the name React-Redux. So provider has a property called store that we can add onto it, and then we just need to supply that with a store. So I'm passing in my store, which is what I created right up here. Now this can be named whatever you want. The only important thing is that this name matches this name, because that's how data passing works. So we're going to set my store, and we're going to make it equal to create store. And create store is a property from the Redux library. And then for create store, we call that and we pass in whatever our root reducer is. I like to call mine root reducer just because that's really what it is. You could call it main reducer, it could be your index file, whatever. Now to look at this, there's different ways to structure a component structure with React, Redux, etc. This is one way of doing it. So inside of our Redux folder, where we're just going to contain all of the stuff we need for that, we have actions, we have a root reducer, and then we have two regular reducers. So this one is not like these other two. It's named root because I specifically want to know that that is the rootmost reducer and that we can just work off of that. So inside of root reducer, we declare that it's called root reducer. Again, it can be called whatever we want. We just have to make sure the names are consistent. And root reducer is going to be equal to combine reducers, which is a built-in thing from Redux itself. So we just import that up top. We call combine reducers, and then we basically just create an object here. And the object has two properties, number and color. These can be whatever you want, but because we are using info from the number reducer, I elected to call this number. And then the color reducer, I elected to call this color, and then we just need to export it at the bottom so this can be made useful other ways in our apps. So going back to app, that's where that comes from. But you might ask, what is this? Because we need these as well. So let's go ahead and check these out. So inside of number reducer, we start out with an initial state of 0. And again, just like everything else, this can be called whatever, as long as this matches when we reference it in other spots. So I like to call it initial state, and I like to put it in caps just so I know that that is that. We set it up as 0, and then we export this default function. We're going to say it takes in state and an action. But then we also have this part here, which might look a little confusing on first glance. So what I'm essentially saying here is take in the state, and if there isn't any state there, use whatever initial state is, which in this case is 0. And then also just take in the action, fat arrow, return, and so now we're going to do a switch, which is essentially like an if-else check, and we're going to check the action that we're given and its type property, which it should have. And we want to see if the case is increment count, then we will return whatever the state is for this component with 1 added onto it. So we're not actually directly modifying the state, we're returning a new thing, whatever the state value is, with 1 added onto it. The other thing on that is we have reset count, so if that happens to come through here, we then return the initial state, which happens to be 0. This will never be modified. So we always could just return 0 here, but I like to have it like this just so I know where everything's at. Then, if this is passed an action that is not one of these two listed right here, our default option is to just return the state, so whatever it had previously. Keep in mind with Redux, every action that's fired goes through every reducer, so most of the time these reducers are going to be getting actions that don't apply to them, and so they'll just ignore it by returning whatever the state was beforehand. So if we go into the color reducer, we can see another example of this. So initial state is light salmon, which is this color that I have over here. And then we export default state if there isn't any state, we use the initial state. That's why this is light salmon on first run through. And then we also take in an action, fat arrow, and then we return the switch. So we have case toggle color. So if we get that in, which it should be actually change color, so because we're not just going back and forth between two, but better naming can be done later. Return action.payload. So action will have a payload property, so that's just what we want to return for if toggle color is the action.type. And then on reset color, we want to just return the initial state, so light salmon. And then, like the last one, if it's not applicable to these two, we just return the default state, and we're all good there. Looking at the last part of how we would go about doing Redux, we have our actions folder. And you could have types just so you don't maybe accidentally mistype something in here. I've just typed them out just because this is a small enough project. So we export const all of these, and we've got the names, increment count, reset count, toggle color, reset color. 3 of these look the same. The color one is the only different thing. It's the one that takes in something. We have it, takes in something called color. It returns a action, which is just an object, with the type property of toggle color, and then a payload property. I like to use payload for this. You can call it really whatever you want, but I learned it using payload, and so that's what I use for this. The main thing though is with payload, we then pass it whatever the color is that we're passing in here. So that'll essentially allow us to, if we go back to our color reducer, action.payload, we're essentially just returning the color here. So maybe you can kind of see what I'm getting at, how our initial state is this, the action.payload is equal to a color that we'll do something with. So let's go ahead and get into our actual components. So we'll close that off, and we'll go ahead and go into normal button. Now I've overcomplicated this just a little bit, so bear with me, but we essentially have a regular class, and if we close this, you see our 3 structure. We have an import statement, we have our class, and then we have our export statement. Absolutely perfect. This component is for the normal button, if that wasn't painfully obvious, and it is not aware of Redux or anything like that, so we don't need anything fancy on here. Now opening this up, let's go line by line. So we have our constructor, we have our super, so it's just superclass initialization, and we have props in there for both those. We set an initial state of normal button count at 0, and then normal button color of light steel blue, which is this cool color right here. So that's default. This is what we're rolling with default. This is, if we refresh the page, we see that this is exactly what it is. The count is 0, and the color of the button is light steel blue. Now if we look at these other functions here, we can see that they all do different things. So increment normal button count sets the state of normal button count, and it takes that value and adds 1 to it. Well, I should say it returns that value with 1 added onto it. We'd never modify the initial state itself. Then, change normal button color. This takes in a color, which we'll look at later. Set state, normal button color, changes it to whatever the color is imported. So this looks a lot like our reducer from our previous thing, but it's basically the same thing. We're just doing things at the component level here instead of the application level. Reset normal button count. This .set state normal button count, and we're hard setting it to 0. This is kind of like when we use the initial state in the number reducer to set things back to 0. It's the same basic concept, except it's component level instead of application level. Then, because when you click reset, we also want the color to go back to light steel blue. We need to also, instead of just setting the number at this, we need to set the color back to light steel blue, which is what it was originally. So this is a pretty good thing for this, and now we'll go into probably the most complicated thing here. So this is when the normal button is pressed. So normal button pressed, it takes in a color as we had before up here, and we're going to say this dot increment normal button count. So that calls not this function and not this function, but it calls this function. So we're basically making a reference to this up here. So all this does is it increments it by 1. So okay, when the button's pressed, it goes up by 1. It's exactly what we want. But we also need to change color. So we're going to have a switch check here. Again, you could have an if you want, and we're just going to say if it's light steel blue, return light sea green. And then if it's light sea green, return light coral. and then if it's light coral, return light gray, and then otherwise return light steel blue. And I realize light steel blue and light gray look very similar. There is a little bit of a difference there in the color, so just be cognizant of that. So I'm going to go ahead and re-expand those, and then we'll look down at the actual thing itself. It's not very interesting down here though. This is our render, so if we go ahead and close off all of these functions here, we can even close off the constructor. So class opens, whatever, and then we have the render method down here. So render opens up. Remember, we return something from render. It's multi-line, so we use this parenthesis. And I went ahead and labeled everything just how I want it to look. Again, you can have this be however you want it to be in your app. This is just what I've done for this, just so it's nice and simple and looks good. We've got our title, stylized somehow, and then we have a line break, and then we have the count. It's equal to this.state.normal button count, so we're referencing our state up here in our constructor, and then whatever it ends up changing as time progresses. Then we have a button, and I used inline styling here just so it can be changed on the fly. There are other ways of doing this too. This is just a good way of doing it, and when you guys learn React Native, I kind of use something similar to this. While it's not inline, it is within the same file, so if you hate inline styling, I'm sorry. But background color, set it to this.state.normal button color, which is right up here, and so that'll just change and allows us to just change that dynamically. Then we've got some other basic properties just to set up how it looks, and then we have our on click, and then we're passing this in here, so this dot normal button pressed, and then we pass in the color here, so that means that the color that goes in here and here is this. So we're basically just passing in the state, but instead of typing out this.state.normal button color, we can just add in color each time because it knows what we're talking about. Then we have the other button, which is the reset button, and I have it stylized outside of this file. And then on click, this.reset normal button count, and then we call that, and it's just labeled. So that's the whole thing for the normal function, or the normal button I should say, sorry about that. Now we can go into the Redux button, which this is probably where a lot of the confusion will be, especially if you haven't really dove too deep into Redux. So first off, in the import block, it's a lot bigger because we have other stuff in it. So we have connect, which is imported from React-Redux, and then we have bind action creators, which is from Redux itself. These will come into play later. I just want to make you aware that we are importing these up here, and then we also need to import any actions that we use. So I've got 4 here. They're imported from Redux actions. Should be good. So again, even though this is a Redux thing, it looks fundamentally the exact same. So if we close off everything else, we have an import block, our class itself, and then we have this export statement. We do have these other 2 things that are outside of the component itself, and I'll explain all of that in just a second. So going down the line here, to set up a Redux component, we have to import, we will always import this stuff, unless we're passing it to it from another thing, but I choose to do it this way because I think it makes things a little bit more predictable. And then we also import the actions. And then down here we have map state to props and map dispatch to props, and these are new functions that we use in Redux. Then instead of doing export default and then whatever our name is, so in this case Redux button, we're going to say export default connect, and then we're going to open parentheses and close parentheses twice. In the first set, we're going to have map state to props and then map dispatch to props. If we are not actually dispatching anything action-wise and we're just reading the application state, we can do map state to props, comma, null. However, we're not doing that, so I'm going to have it be map dispatch to props. Then in the second set of parentheses, we have the actual file name, so it's the same thing roughly, it's just a little bit more there. So map state to props takes the global application state from our Redux data store, and then we basically just return some keys, and the values, it's state, not this.state, because we're outside of the component itself, we're just inside the file. So it's referring to the application state, so application state.number, and then state.color, and we have those set to that. So now this is mapped the state of the application to the props available to this component. Map dispatch to props is somewhat similar. It's for when we want to dispatch an action. So we go ahead and declare this, and we say it takes in something called dispatch, and then we're going to return bind action creators, which is one of the things that we imported up here from Redux. This just binds things for us so everything plays nicely. So we're going to say bind action creators, and we're going to call that, and then we are just going to basically pass in curly brackets, and then separated by commas, we're just going to have any actions that we use. So these 4 that we use right here are the same 4 that we imported from our actions file up here. And that's it for map state to props and map dispatch to props. I know that might be a little bit confusing. I hope I can explain it a little bit more as we go into here. So, opening these back up, just so we can see what's actually inside of our component itself. So we have a couple different things. Let's go ahead and start at the top. So we have on Redux button pressed, and this is part of the dispatch thing. This is an action that we have. So when the button is pressed for the Redux thing, this thing right here, we want to increment the count, and we've mapped the state to the props, and then we've mapped the dispatch to the props as well. So we're trying to reference this from this other file, increment count. So we're going to call this.props.incrementCount. That's it. That's all we needed to do. And then we're also going to call this.changeColor, and we're going to pass it this.props.color, which is what we set on map state to props down here. So again, this just calls this.props.incrementCount. It's an action creator somewhere else. It's located in our actions folder. And then we have this.changeColor, which is, notice how there's no props here because changeColor is a function that we have access to right here. So we're going to pass it this.props.color. ChangeColor takes in a color, which happens to be this, and we're going to say if color is light salmon, this.props.toggleColor, like green. So we're calling the actual toggle color function, and we're supplying it with a value, and that will flow through the reducers and then end up in our global application state. So we go through and we check these again, and then we have an else at the end that allows us to basically cycle through continuously. So it's saying if it doesn't mention these other things, then just toggle the color back to light salmon, which is the default. It allows us to just go through in a nice little loop. So I could probably close that off now. And then we also have reset button pressed. So this.props.resetCount resets the thing for the Redux button, and then this.props.resetColor changes it back to light salmon, as you remember from earlier in the video when we actually looked at the color and number reducers. So we can go and close that off too. And there's that one. And then now inside of our render button function, which is a custom function that we made, we'll basically just return the button. It has some inline styling, and we're going to say, alright, this either returns this.props.color or this returns light coral, which this was here before. Yeah, so I've hard set it in the, not in the actions, in the color reducer to be light salmon. And I thought I cleaned this up, but we should just be able to delete this. And we're fine, because we're not actually using that color anymore. And we've got the same custom styling applied right there. And then on click, this is just an empty function, this.onRedux button pressed, which is up here, and that takes us through the whole flow of what we need to do. But this itself, render button, this is just a function or a method because it's of this class that just returns some JSX. In this case, it's a very complicated button. Render, something that you guys should be used to by now working with React. Render just returns some JSX as well. As we go down here, instead of rendering the actual button itself, I just call this .render button because I like to move my stuff and separate it out as much as possible. So it's the exact same as the normal button. As you can see visually, it's the same thing besides just a different color. But I've elected to pull it out just because it is a little bit more styled. But otherwise, everything there is the same. So again, when we click this, not only do we have to increment the count, but we also have to change the color. So render button is called on the initial render of this. So when it tries to do this, whenever this whole component itself is called, render is called, render button's called, render button renders a button with a background color of this.props.color. By default, this.props.color is equal to light salmon, and that is apparently light salmon. I don't know, I'm not a designer, but that's how that works. When we click it, it flows through and it calls these action creators. Well, yeah, these are for the color, but then it will also call increment count. Increment count, we go into our actions, increment count and toggle color, pass the color. Both these actions get called and fired. They flow to all reducers. These two reducers, each one takes in separate things. So, this is the color one, it takes in stuff related to the color. This is the count one, it takes in stuff related to the count. Both those reducers get done with their jobs, and they return whatever they're going to return. That data is then used by the root reducer, which combines them and sets them equal to a number and color key inside of an object, and this is our application state, our global application state available anywhere. And then we do that because it's wrapped right here. This wraps our entire this wraps our entire app, so it's able to be used anywhere. So over in normal component, I could, if I wrote out map state to props and then did a connect thing down here, we could make use of this color over here. We're not going to for the sake of this exercise, but just to let you know, it can be done, and we don't have these two never have to communicate. It's all done through the data that's stored in the Redux store itself. So I know this might have been a little bit complicated to go through. I know it's a lot to take in. Redux is fairly complicated, but it is mostly just a lot of boilerplate, and once you understand the data flow of clicking something in a component triggers a action creator, the action creator returns an action, the action flows through a reducer, the reducer goes into the root reducer, global reducer, whatever you want to call it, and then whatever that reducer returns becomes the application state that we reference with this.props. Whatever the key is. I hope that's made things a little bit more clear. Thank you for watching on this, and let me know if you have any questions or anything down in the comment section. Thank you.